if I like, please do tell me. But hopefully it should be fine. If it happens, it will happen like once, and it will just be choppy. Okay. When the West sends weapons elsewhere in the world, it shapes that conflict in a significant way. We shaped it when we sent weapons to the Mujahideen in the Middle East and destabilized that entire region for 40 plus years. We shaped it when France intervenes in Africa, for instance, in Ansar Dine, like in funding rebel groups or funding like state governments against those rebel groups. And of course, we shape it in Ukraine every day when we help it defend against the brutal attack from Russia. I'm going to first talk about why it is that when we get more defensive capabilities, this helps the people who are defending, help end the war sooner, and do so by imposing imposing extremely high costs on aggressor states. Then I'm going to talk about the casualties of war and why those reduce. I want to posit two things about defensive capabilities before I get going. The first one is it's easier to defend something than it is to attack something. It takes less logistical efforts to route supply chains into Russian territory, for instance, than to simply remain within Ukrainian territory. It's easier to call to arms people to defend their homeland than it is to invade someone else's. And you have more intelligence about what is going on locally there that you can use to your advantage. Defensive military capabilities from the West are immensely helpful in helping them do this defense in which they have somewhat of a natural advantage, but no guarantee of success. And the reason for this is a couplefold. Firstly, because these weapons allow you to do things like prevent the encroachment of your territory. This looks like technologies you can use to dig trenches, like anti-air equipment or tank mines that you can use to stop tanks from rolling over into the territory. I think the good thing about these technologies, besides the fact that they're ruthlessly effective and developed by extremely sophisticated defensive technologies, is that you don't require whole supply chains or whole maintenance crews to continually maintain them. So a lot of these technologies are not motorized, crucially, in a way that offensive capabilities like tanks have to be motorized because they have to move. This means that there's far less components to maintain, and often the things that take the most wear and tear, that is the things that exist within enemy territories of conflict states, are precisely the sorts of things that we don't have to use on our side. Secondly, I think the Western supply is crucial here for two reasons. The first one is because technology is often only accessible to the West. Things like the Iron Dome in Israel is something that only very few companies could have developed, but also things like the fact that you only have a handful, only have so much money as a place that has been invaded, or as a state that is desperately trying to defend against invading rebel groups who will otherwise win the conflict. I think in these situations, what is really crucial is the ability to get the resources and technology from the West that you otherwise do not have access to, that is crucial to increasing the costs of this invasion in the first place. What are the impacts of this? I think the most important thing in this round is whether or not we can cause a war of attrition to come to an end. That is to say, can we impose enough costs on aggressor states like Russia such that they stop invasions into places like Ukraine? The way that we get attrition on our side is twofold. The first one is we simply prolong the existence of this conflict, because now the conflict requires Russia to continually make encroachments into Ukrainian territory. To show that they have made some progress, they need to continually invade. They can't just take back Russian territory that was previously occupied by Ukraine. They have to push further into the territories that Ukraine rightfully holds. The consequence of this is, first off, that bottom-up ability to maintain the war reduces. So things like recruiting soldiers to enter the war is a lot harder at the point at which you have dragged it out over extended periods of time, as we see in the status quo. But secondly, there are top-down changes. That is to say, once you make the war last a significant period of time, there are incentives for leaders to pull out because it becomes immensely costly to do so to their economies and to their national credibility. The consequence of the bottom-up and top-down changes is that if we can drag out the existence of these wars over long enough periods of time, then people who are incredibly weaker will eventually succeed. And note on their side of the house, this has to also be eventually how a conflict ends. It just takes a lot slower, right? Because there was never the case that Ukraine was going to win by invading Russia and taking that over. This was an incredibly asymmetric war. We think the most important thing then was Ukraine was able to defend its territory such that Russian aggression ended sooner. The flip of the government might say, well, if you offense, this also is a form of defense, right? But the flip of this argument when it comes to attrition specifically is that offense pulls the other country more into war. So when you have taken over significant tracts of Russian territory, and crucially that you have been very successful in doing so, I think that is when you able as Russian leaders to justify a continuation of that war in the context of they are invading us, not just being seen as an aggressive takeover of the territory. And I would note here that there are two versions of how these conflicts can happen. So either you think that Ukrainian generals, in the absence of offensive support from the West, would continue to invade Russia and do offensive capabilities, or that they wouldn't. Under either one of those views, it doesn't really matter, because under either one of those views, the fact that they're not particularly successful in doing offensive capabilities, or that they don't try in the first place, means that we access this benefit, which is to say that most of the resources in the war are dedicated eventually towards the defensive front, where the West can have immense help, and we ultimately end up with these wars ending sooner. The end point of this is the defensive technologies that the West have are crucial to defend illegal territory. We think that is the most important thing, and the ways that wars eventually end. I want to secondly talk about the casualties of war, while we get less of them. Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
Russia is fine with keeping the Ukrainian territory it's already captured. How do defensive capacities help Ukraine get the territory that was stolen from it?
We think the most important thing in these situations is not the sort of total victory that you might consider in the West. And I would note here that Ukraine is a very convenient example for the opposition bench in this debate. But I would also like for them to talk about situations, for instance, like the Mujahideen, or like Ansar Dine, or like all of the impositions and interventions that France does in Africa. I think in all of those cases, it is not a matter of who rightfully controls which territory and how do we want to resolve, but simply can we get the wars to end? I think insofar as we're able to achieve that, that is how we get this debate. I think on their side of the house, they'll have a very hard time proving that Ukraine is actually successful and tractable in getting that territory back for the reasons I've already told you. Let me talk now about the casualties of war. And I would posit here that in many conflicts, and Ukraine is a notable exception, but the most conflicts where Western countries provide military backing, Western weapons are the most lethal thing that can possibly exist in these conflicts. They're the most technologically advanced thing. And defensive technology specifically means that there's less death now and less death decades down the line as these weapons continue to be used. Why is this important? It is important for strategic and humanitarian reasons. The strategic reasons is that when you send offensive weapons, as we saw when the West armed the Mujahideen in the 70s, and now those weapons are used by Muslim terrorists like the Taliban. I think the consequence of this is often that you get a risk of co-optation. That is to say that the Taliban is able to take those weapons and use them in their own assault against fundamental human rights in their own country. And it is very difficult to take back offensive weapons once they've been given. It's very hard to control where they go in the chaos of war. Versus defensive weapons are somewhat more robust to this. It's a lot harder to use them, for instance, to kill civilians and to oppress people. Secondly, I would just posit that the West isn't always morally right. And at that point, I think what is crucial is that we give defensive capabilities that don't end up killing more innocent people or killing people who are forced by Vladimir Putin into the front lines. I think all of those things were absolutely atrocious. It's something we're able to avoid. We avoid things like making mass killings easier in parts of the world. We make it so that there's less conflict and less reprisals at the point at which more offensive things are being done in places like the Middle East. Dropping offensive weaponry destabilizes entire subcontinents. We hated it when it happened in the 70s. We hate it now. We're very.
I thank the Prime Minister for the fine speech and invite the Leader of Opposition to open Opposition's side. Here.
All right, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great, I just have one request. Please don't unmute yourselves. I'll take a POI. I'll ask for a POI when I want one. Write in the chat if you need it. Cool. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're going to show why this ends the war faster and reduces the overall likelihood of wars. We win in 2 main ways. One, this is the largest impact. And secondly, preventing the war is logically prior to needing to supply the weapons in the future. Sorry, I lied. There's a third. It's also just true that you cannot defend yourself forever. Ukraine already lost Crimea. Now it's going to lose more of it. It will eventually be eaten away as Russia continually attacks. It takes more and more slivers off it unless you can offensively attack and take things back. One piece of framing. These weapons are very unlikely to be abused. One, the West just conditions its aid and says you're not allowed to use it to attack significant civilian infrastructure, killing people indiscriminately. Secondly, the country doesn't want to create the backlash within, for example, Russia that these kinds of targets create, and instead prefers to use the still limited amount of overall aid it receives to target symbols like the Kremlin, like the bridge that connects to Crimea, or important military targets like the missile launchers, fortifications, supply lines, etc. Cool. Why do we think that why do we end the wars faster and reduce the overall harms of war? Number one, asymmetric warfare is very likely to become a war of attrition. We think that when the stronger power invades, one, it oftentimes doesn't feel like it has a meaningful cost unless there is offensive retribution. When what is happening is some Russian soldiers die some of the time. That's obviously terrible, but it doesn't have the classic mechanism of Putin needing to get voted in. It needs to reach an apex of people being willing to overthrow him, or the elites within no longer being willing to do that. The kinds of costs that are needed for that is costs of widespread of either losing the war or widespread destruction of significant parts of like the supply lines and the train tracks and things like that. Whereas just losing some soldiers clearly is never going to be enough. Secondly, they often have a sunk cost in front of their own public once they invade, and they don't want to lose face. And so you need them to have, they don't want to leave, and they're likely to enter a war of attrition. Thirdly, they just think they're going to win. Like Putin has won Crimea already. He's won significant parts of Ukraine. Okay, maybe he'll have to stop eventually. He'll sign a treaty for 6 months, and then he'll do it again and win more of it. The second part, we also don't think that the weaker power is likely to give in. One, it has everything to lose, right? The political elites within the Ukraine face going to the gulag or disappearing. The economic elites face losing everything that they own and becoming impoverished as the Russians take all their money and appropriate their goods. Thirdly, the average person now faces living under the Russian rule, which oftentimes includes having terrible things happen to them, lack of freedom of press, lack of freedom of voting, etc. So they have a ton of things to actually lose. Secondly, people feel nationalistic. They care about their country. They care about what they belong to. They feel like it is meaningful. They rally behind the flag, and they are willing to endure great suffering to resist. We see this when we have tons of examples of this. When, for example, Britain was left alone during the Second World War, and despite all of the odds, refused to give up because they were unwilling to be conquered by the Nazis, despite everything. So we think that there are very likely to be very significant wars of attrition. Thirdly, there are significant advantages of defenders that makes it difficult to take everything at once normally. You have things like fortifications, you have multiple levels of fortifications. So even if the initial ones are overrun, they then reach the second stage and can't just break through immediately. You have and things like this. Why do we think that when a war is long, this is really bad? One, we think the cost on both lives actually ends up being higher. If a war took 6 months, then the amount of people who ended up dying would just be far less. But secondly, we also think that the devastation is far more significant when the war is long. Number one, on infrastructure, far more of the roads and public institutions are destroyed. More factories are ruined and put out of service. The gas plant, the dam, which was destroyed in the Ukraine, which means that electricity can no longer be created. We think that all of these mean that people lose access to basic services like water, like heating, like gas, like electricity, which means that during the winter they freeze if they live in the Ukraine, or if they live in somewhere that's a desert in the summer, they get dehydrated and die of thirst. We also think that they are often left homeless without a place to stay because you cannot rebuild their homes due to the destruction of the infrastructure and their homes being destroyed during the war. We also think the economy is destroyed. People's businesses shut down, employees disappear, goods can't be transferred. This means that when these people are often left just without the money to actually feed themselves, without savings to build themselves up after the war, and they and their children enter a cycle of poverty that leaves them with nothing. Finally, we think that more and more people become refugees with nowhere to call home, nowhere to belong, and without the community that used to surround them as they've been uprooted from where they lived due to the war. We think that all of these are just terrible effects of a long and drawn-out war, and we think that since the alternative is a war of attrition, we want to prevent that. Why do we think that we prevent these long drawn-out wars and probably also just prevent wars in general? Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah, so in Ukraine right now, there's a massive shortage of defensive missiles. Why is that?
Yeah, I don't think there's a massive shortage of defensive missiles. And more than that, I think even if there is, it's because they didn't have offensive weapons, as I'm going to explain in a moment. But let's start with deterrence. I think the stronger power is much more likely to be deterred on our side. One, they know that escalation leads to a much higher cost because because the other side has many more significant weapons that they can use. Secondly, they see a real cost. For example, they see parts of Moscow being bombed. They see the Kremlin being attacked. Thirdly, you can target the infrastructure and facilities needed for war, like the supply lines and train lines, which mean it is much more difficult to actually win the war in the first place. Fourthly, the chance of counterattacks and you actually losing something creates an enormous loss of face internally. If you end up losing Crimea because the Ukrainians can actually counterattack and take that back, you have lost a massive thing. When the Ukraine managed to take back Kherson, that was a huge blow to Putin, and if they had the weapons to carry on, then Putin would have almost certainly sued to peace. But more than that, he wouldn't have gone to war in the first place because taking the chance of losing these things would have been a massive, been to take a massive risk. But we also think that you're likely to win. Directly answering the POI now, notice, offensive weapons often degrade the enemy capability, providing defense. When you can attack, you can destroy bombers, you can destroy missile launchers, you can destroy artillery, you can kill the soldiers before they reach their lines. This means you don't need 1,000 missiles to shoot out the 1,000 missiles they have. You need one bomb to blow up that bomb base or blow up that supply line. Secondly, you can take the initiative, which means you can concentrate localized forces to overwhelm the enemy rather than letting them do that to you, meaning that you need less localized fortifications and less localized defense because you can attack them, making them have to localize forces. Secondly, the West weapons are far more effective. They're accurate, which means you can be more targeted with your strikes and don't hurt as many people as when you use your offensive weapons. Secondly, they can evade enemy defense due to technical capabilities. They can avoid electronic warfare. They can avoid hacking. They can avoid tracking, which means they can actually deliver their payloads. They're very destructive. This looks like cyber warfare that can cripple an entire missile system, or jamming that prevents their radio from functioning, which means they're very, very effective and damaging. They can penetrate defensive fortifications with directed blasts, like through the bunker busters. They can gather more intelligence. This means that over time, it's also going to be more difficult for the attacker to sustain themselves, which also makes it more difficult to justify the attempt at invasion in the first place. Please oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for the fine speech, and now I invite BPM to continue government side here.
Hi, can you hear me okay? All right, POIs in the chat, please. I'll be starting in just a moment. All right, yeah, I'll take one from closing and let's get going. The case coming from open government is simple. War is horrible. Offenses are when the most people die, especially those who are innocent. And we're happy to stand by the side that can stop wars the fastest. And even if we don't, we show you why the fewest people lose their lives on our side of the house. The first thing I want to do is I want to be very clear about the framing in this debate and how it is that the wars of attrition work. There are three ways in which a conflict can progress. Firstly, you somehow miraculously manage to push the invaders back, which is like the delusion that all of opposition bench seems to be operating under. The issue, however, is that this is an overly romantic characterization of how these wars are going to go. It is very unlikely, if not impossible, and this is because of the two crucial pieces of context that this motion is giving us. Firstly, it's already the case that you're militarily weaker than your opponent. This means that you're very unlikely to have the resources, or even if the West gives you the guns, you're going to have the manpower to be able to effectively push back while also defending yourself. Secondly, though, the motion already gives you that your country has been invaded. What this means is that your stronger neighbor has made the calculation, and they think that even with Western support, they will be able to push you back to a good extent. What this means then is that unless things drastically change, you are going to continue being on the back foot within this debate. You are going to continue losing. You're not going to be able to make any form of substantial progress against the enemy. The second possibility on side opposition is that when you're being weaker, you're going to continue being pushed back. That is, unless the West does give you support, what this means is that the Russians are going to continue inching into your territory. What you do is you provide them a unique incentive to keep going. That is, even if it's expensive, it's not that expensive for them. And crucially, it's part of the initial calculation they made when planning the war. Because crucially, we get a big information jump on them. When the West provides these weapons, these are unlikely to be part of the logistical and the military planning of the other side. We throw a wrench in the works and we drastically change the costs in a way that shocks the enemy economy and the military. The third alternative then is a very reasonable thing we stand by: opening government. We don't propose any delusions about suddenly winning the war, but we make the very simple observation that war is a matter of money and men. When you make it so the other side is losing more money and more men than you are, that is when it's going to be the case that the wars are going to be worth it for them. Yeah.
Can I pause the timer because one of the panelists left? I paused it at 2:12. I'm so sorry.
This is gonna ruin the tour, I think, but it's fine. To quote. What's the name of the guy who got arrested? I forgot. Anyway.
All right, Olivia, are you back?
I am sorry. I've had to switch devices because my internet crashed.
Okay, perfect. So, 2:10.
What was I shouting about when you interrupted me?
It's about money.
Okay. All right. 1 moment. Okay, restarting on 3, 2, 1. War is about money and men. We uniquely prove to you then how we're able to accrue sufficient casualties and economic costs to make it no longer worth it for the other side to do these things. What is this motion about then? What is it that we're giving people? This is about providing the defensive side with equipment like mortars, emplacements, anti-tank and anti-air missiles that you can use in the field, machine gun emplacements, trench digging tools that you can use to fortify yourself. This is not a debate about malware, given it was briefly mentioned, given that there is no real cost to them supplying it to you, it's just software. So I think it's more so about the actual material trade-off in what's being given. There are two effects of this motion then. Firstly, the country that you're providing these to has to primarily stick to the defensive. Offensive operations just become more difficult. What this means then is that the likely war-hungry generals that Yishai kindly characterizes for me are now far less able to go on the offensive when they don't have this equipment. It's difficult, if not impossible, to justify to the political or the military leadership. You no longer get these overly ambitious operations for the sake of the war. Secondly, though, we make it insanely more difficult for the enemy to push back against you. And I want to give you the crucial analytical reason here. This is because far more men die when you attack than when you're defending. This is simple. You have a defensive advantage when you're entrenched somewhere, when you have already put your shit down, when you're ready for the enemy, you're expecting them. When they have to push you back, they have to leave their emplacements. They have to come to you. They have to find you. This is when you can use your equipment to quickly take them out before they can damage you. This crucial advantage then means that even if you have fewer people, less equipment, you are far more able to take them out. Beyond this, though, I think the support of the West is crucial for a few reasons. It's the case that the West primarily has the most weapons it can hand out, so I don't think opposition can say that they are able to get defensive weapons anyway. But even if they are, we explained the importance of the technical capacity of Western equipment for things like self-controlling systems, or even if they do get them, I think it's important you're able to sufficiently and fully supply the few men you have. You're not going to win the war on quantity, but you must have quality to be able to do well. Therefore, then, I think at this point you ought to be convinced that it's far more difficult to basically push for the war. I now want to push back on the impact that you get from side opposition, which mostly has to do about the political change, etc. The first thing I want to point out, and I want to weigh this against both OO and back half, is that any impact about like the political situation in the enemy or the domestic country is going to be very uncertain. This debate is not just about Ukraine, it's about myriads of different wars, and I don't think it's fair to characterize that one thing is true somewhere when it's going to be very false somewhere else. Our case works in all scenarios. But beyond this, let me actually engage with what analysis they do give us. The first thing they tell us is that you don't really going to use these weapons in a way that like really hurts the enemy or hurts civilians on their side of the house. I think the issue here is like, firstly, the most serious way in which civilians die isn't because you're offensive or malicious, but there are two forms. A, many times civilians die in accidents in the use of this equipment. When you're firing at the enemy, especially when the enemy is in an entrenched position like a city, this is when people die. But also secondly, the use of offensives involves the displacement of civilians. That is, the act of attacking the enemy and moving the front lines is when your side or the side that's being pushed back has to tell the civilians in the area they have to pack their shit, move out, and go to the other end of the country. That is how it is then that they hurt far more people on side opposition. The reason then that you do get change is that the word spreads about casualties. No matter how much the Kremlin spins it, the death of like tens of thousands of young Russian men will spread through word of mouth, through families, through veterans. You don't have a way to hide this. Crucially, then even beyond this, you lose the incentive to continue fighting. This is because the war is no longer the easy win you thought it would be, but rather it has become a long campaign that you economically cannot afford for all the reasons opposition kindly analyzes for us. That is, it becomes way too expensive, your economy is embargoed, it's impossible to keep going. Closing, please, quick.
Sure. To attack and invade a weaker state, you need things like ethnic and nationalistic incentives. These states don't care about attrition. They're okay with fighting low-level conflict perpetually.
Look, I would say it's utterly implausible to say that they're going to continue fighting regardless of losses. But even if they do, it's the case that they don't have the ability to hurt you. You're able to stop them when they do all the things opening opposition talks about. They can bomb your civilians when you have the anti-air system to protect yourselves. But also, I think we give a very plausible case for why wars get shorter. Crucially, the other thing you shouldn't adjudicate the debate on is about whether the West makes good choices. It's very often the case that they found parties that ought never have been funded in the first place. This looks like, for example, the Iraqi invasion of Iran in the 80s or the Contras in Nicaragua. Rather, we prove to you why fewer engagements happen when it's far more expensive for both sides to attack. Therefore, you're far more likely to resort to the type of negotiations that don't lead to these losses. The weighing here is simple then. I don't care if opposition talk about infrastructure. We show you how we protect civilians and how we protect soldiers from doing brutal deaths at the hands of equipment on the side of the enemy. Even if the war is a stalemate, I think you can still keep the economy running. The worst harm you can bring to soldiers is death, and to civilians is displacement. This debate should be weighed in stability, and we uniquely give you this in opening government. Very proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for the fine speech and now invite the DLO to continue the debate. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to show why we win the clash of where is the weaker side likelier to win the war. I will impact it and show why it should win the debate on its own. If I have time, I will also run a second case on why this will make the Western allies more loyal to the West and why this is a good outcome for everyone else involved. Before that, a lot of extenders rebuttal. Firstly, I want to notice something very crucial. All of OG's analysis on why defense is easier than offense is self-defeating, because this is precisely the reason they don't need as much help with this. They keep telling us about cutting-edge technology that the West can give, like Iron Dome and anti-arrows, but they never explain why it is necessary. To be clear, we do think there's a trade-off in this debate. We bite the bullet. Some more people will die. Some more infrastructure will be destroyed in the short run. But we think that precisely because of the advantage of the defender that OG describes, it will be of a smaller extent of difference than the extent of difference you are able to make in the offensive, which is much harder without Western aid. Secondly, we think there are many natural barriers that help defense. Things like your land, which often has a very large buffer on the border. Things like seas, if we are talking about future allies like Taiwan in a future war. So it is very often self-defending in many other ways. We think that you can prioritize per the motion, not give away no defenses, meaning that in the most extreme attacks on your civilians, you would still dissect the missile, like if they directly shoot at the center of Kiev, but you would probably do less defensive mechanisms in like the suburbs where you have less cities. We think that we can provide things like shelters and help them build shelters that have nothing to do with weapons. Many of them already have them underground. We think that we can accept refugees to help them defend themselves. We think that there are so many other ways to help mitigate the harm to civilians that are not just through supplying weapons, which is why we think we have a somewhat cost to immediate civilian life, but we think it is capped and limited. Secondly, I want to observe something very crucial. The reason Ukraine has a shortage of defensive weapons, CG, is because the war lasted 2.5 years. The reason Ukraine has a shortage of manpower, OG, is because the war lasted 2.5 years, both of which they had abundance of when the war started. But when it goes on and drags on, they lose it. And this is part of the problem and part of why HUJI wins. If we show shorter war, it shows that in the end, we also get better defense. Because defense is limited, it runs out, and you eventually run out of it. Cool. Why do we win? Let's talk about why do we have shorter wars. We hear, oh, you will not win anyway because you lack the manpower, but we never hear any analysis on why the additional manpower is necessary if we have the technology. When HUJI analyzed specific reasons for why we end the war that are not contingent on manpower. For example, you can directly target military facilities or crucial infrastructure. You don't need manpower for this because these usually tend to be distant from populous centers. Countries tend to build their military bases in like the rural areas far from where people live. So you don't need a surgical operation with a lot of people on the ground. You can just fire rockets at it and let it like turn the sand into glass. Secondly, we think that a manpower problem is something that we can make up for if the war is shorter on our side, because when you give them weapon, the manpower that they have is extremely motivated. Almost every young Ukrainian man volunteered to the military even before they drafted because they wanted to defend their country. The reason they now have lack of manpower is because many of them either died or were injured across the going on of this war. If they had stronger weapons from the get-go, then they would be able to win it. Thirdly, we think that they would waste this manpower anyway, because here's the crucial thing. The fact that OG doesn't want to give them offensive weapons doesn't mean that they will not try offensive operations. Case in point, despite the fact that Ukraine mostly gets defensive weapons, it did try to recoup its lands, because that's what politicians usually want to do, show victory. And this means that they would still lose so much manpower that will not be available to defend the civilians, but they will just die faster because they will not be able to shoot back as effectively because they have outdated weapons. We think that additionally, we are able to do things such as waste resources of the other side, because once they have to start defending themselves, they need to also spread their resources thin. So now they need some of their soldiers and some of their technology to defend themselves and only have less for offensive. We think that it means that it creates a credible threat of escalation, like Ishai analyzed, and therefore you don't want to escalate further. We think it creates costs to your country and to your elites, which pressure you to end the war. This is why we think we win the question of where we end the war faster. Last thing that we hear on this is they calculated the cost of the war in advance. One, symmetric, they calculated the cost of defensive weapons in advance, but secondly, bullshit. Like, Putin thought he would conquer Ukraine in 3 days. We don't think you always calculate the cost in advance. No one expected the West to support so much. We think in the future, now after the West supports more, then it will be a signaling effect that you have a reason to not invade, because now they will start calculating it in advance. Which brings me precisely to my weighings. Why is our case winning? Before that, closing.
Yeah, so isn't there a deep sunk cost at the point of conflict? I'm not sure why you're going to get the renewed deterrence that you're claiming at the point where you're already knee deep into their territory.
But you're knee deep into their territory with Ishai giving you like 4 minutes of analysis on why you don't suffer almost any cost, because in asymmetrical warfare, they are not capable of doing much damage to you. So I think this is just very uncharitable of the analysis. Cool, weighings. Let's say even that we don't have the idea of more people die across time on its own. Let's say that a lot more people on our side, despite all the mitigations I gave, die in the short run. Why do we still win? One, we think that when wars are longer, this is when the weaker side gets even weaker, because you lose support of the West across time, because political capital to continue giving aid is lost, because leaders get changed. So you get people like Trump and Orban who are anti-aid, and then you don't have either defense or offense, which means you get none of OG's benefits in the long run if you don't end the war fast enough. We think that it means that also the asymmetry of power gets worse, because the weaker side gets weaker and weaker, and their crucial infrastructure and manpower is lost and drained as the war goes on, so they are much more certain to lose. We think that when we end the war faster, it creates future deterrence that can prevent future invasions from the get-go. We think that long wars also cause global economic crises very often, because they destroy supply chains of significant resources. And we think that when a war is ended faster on our side, and when the Western allies see that they can trust us for support, they are willing to side with us. This is when Taiwan is less likely to get closer with partners like China, because it knows that the US will have its back. Oppose.
Okay. We're going to do a few things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about how effective offensive weapons actually are, dealing with some of the things left out of opening up. Second, I'm going to talk about how, if we are able to sustain this provision, finally, I'm going to engage on the risk of regional escalation, I think the last thing that CEO said. Let's talk about how effective offensive weapons actually are. Because the opening opposition claim here is that you need to be striking offensively, because that's what you require to have the other side give up. You need them to lose something. This is obviously dependent on the offensive actually being successful. And I just want you to notice how simplistic the claims that they are having are, right? They say, oh, like you're just going to use one bomb and then you destroy their military facility, or like you're going to penetrate the defensive fortifications. This is something they are making sound really easy when it really is not. I'm going to give you a few reasons new to opening government about why not. The first thing is that, like, you need to have the knowledge about where all of those places are, like all the military facilities that you need to be bombing with their one bomb. And very often, as a smaller, like the party in asymmetric power, you do not have that knowledge. And it's very difficult to gather that knowledge very often, because frequently to be able to gather that intelligence, you would need to, for example, penetrate the air superiority when they have the planes flying, when they can shoot your drones out and stuff like that. Secondly, they think that you can you have military facilities standing so close you can just shoot a rocket. Obviously, a stronger military power is not that stupid to be building their core military facilities next to you. So frequently, you do need to be stepping into that territory. You need to be trying to pushing with the supply lines. You need to be using the manpower. And again, like it is very difficult to get there. Like even if they are going to be flying over the bomb, like superior powers, they tend to have a huge amount of like airplanes in there. Like it's difficult to get there with their bomb. So it's quite hard. If they are using like people, right, like manpower, then it's really difficult to, because of the defensive advantage, to get effectively through the other side. For example, if they are trying to strike hard, they need to go through and try to capture urban centers. This is notoriously incredibly difficult for the person who's going on the offensive because you don't know the terrain. You don't know where, like, where they have like supplies of weapons, where they can have a sniper, when they can have all of those things. If you have to be crossing mountains, if you need to be dealing with the fortifications, that is incredibly difficult for anyone to do. The final thing I want to note is that you obviously mobilize the other side more. We agree with opening government that it's easy once you are able to defend yourself for a prolonged period of time for the other side to be giving up. But once you start striking, especially most of the invasions that these like places do, say Russia invaded Ukraine saying that Ukraine is a security risk. It is easy to make that narrative strike harder once you are actually going on the offensive. That's when you get them mobilized more. That's when you turn the stride of the war that previously might have been tiring. So the conclusion that you should be making out of this is that opening opposition doesn't get to have easy little strike, dropping a bomb and winning the war and like scaring the enemy. It would have to be a quite prolonged operation in order to get any of their benefits. Obviously, comparatively, it's substantially easier to be able to defend to be able to defend yourself. Then, given this, can we actually sustain this provision? And this is important, right? Because now you should believe that the conflict will not be able to end immediately. So are they able to sustain the funding at all? HUJI explains that while it is much harder to justify offensive funding, they claim that people care about cost of living, but we noted several reasons about why it is not asymmetric. The first reason is because how the media is able to report on it and how many people notice and pay attention to that to provisions in the first place. Because people do care about costs of living, but you need enough people to start lobbying and being angry about the funding that you are providing. And crucially, offensive spending is very easy to spin to make people backlash against it, right? Because you can point out that it's a useless spending, that you are causing death, that you are that you are warmongering, or the perception of that is obviously worse, right? Because if you are funding offensive weapons, then it's seen as useless, because if the other side can go on an offensive, then they're probably not that weak, then it's not necessary, then we are not protecting them, then we could be spending the money elsewhere. Obviously, if you are doing a defensive weapons, then it is seen as that, then it's far less likely to be spun that way. But secondly, it is seen that the other side is actually really weak. So it's far easier to get more people on the side of continuing the funding. That deals with the stuff that we get onto it from closing opposition as well. Secondly, on the expectations, because Matt says that you are more likely to support it because it ends sooner. This only works if it ends sooner. I just gave you lots of reasons why it wouldn't end sooner. And the problem with that is the issue with the expectations, because once you are creating the expectation that maybe the offensive war is going to be really quick, people are going to get angry at the point when it isn't. While a defensive funding tends to come with the expectations that it might require a more prolonged funding in the first place. So the final thing is just like it is. HUJI explains why it is more expensive. You need to be resupplying. You need to be continuously redoing the ammunition. All of that means that that it becomes far more difficult to be funding that continuously. So you're far more likely to be abandoning. Before I talk about why, even if you can't sustain on both sides, we still win, I'll take over.
At best, you cast doubt to how fast we'll end the war. You're uncomparative once you never prove how it will end on your side, and we prove it will never end if you are just playing defensive.
No. So because all the flip side of what I said, right? Like the other side, if they have to do the thing that you want to be doing, such as going through your terrain, such as having to having to gather all the intelligence, not having the mobilization that it requires, it's obviously much more likely to end sooner, because it's also more difficult for them to justify. So why is it then worse if you are Why is it hard to sustain on, even if you can't sustain it on both sides, why is it still better on ours? Because if you abandon it on both sides, on their side, the weaker nation is extended to the enemy territory. They have gone out of their defensive positions, so they are far more likely to get massively hit by that if suddenly their supply stops. That's when all the problems with like becoming war prisoners, the other side being able to retaliate incredibly, happens on their side. This also flips all on Western allies, because now you are distrusted for that reason, because you abandoned in incredibly weak positions the defense. You are far more likely to be able to sustain, even if on both sides the funding stops. The final thing about like Cold War, like you need to go to fight over influence. I would say that the other parties are much more likely to involve if you are seen as a risk. If you are on the offensive, there are refugees from the other countries that you are now invading. That's when other powers are much more likely to get involved, and it spills into a regional conflict because of all those reasons I'm proud to propose.
I think the government vote for the fine speech, and to conclude the debate, I invite opposition whip. Here.
Cool. For POIs, you can just yell at me. I will not be looking at the chat. I'll try to take 2. Time starts in 3, 2. I agree with CG. The only thing in this debate that matters in this debate is a question of funding. Why? Because both top half teams assume that funding exists in a static form and that you are able to either end the war faster on gov or end the war faster on op. This is not the case. The West is very fickle, especially in a post-Afghanistan West that is looking towards primacy as a new way to deal with these threats. The amount of money you get is often incredibly contingent on the way in which that money is perceived and whether or not states are willing to fund in the first place. So the question of increasing the size of the pie is what allows you to get to the wars of attrition G talks about as being important, or allows you to get to the offensive operations that in the war that OO talks about as important. And notably, I asked a POI almost 30 minutes ago about how you were able to, for example, retake cities that were stolen from you in an invasion. This is important because states like Russia can just hold those territories in perpetuity, and then as soon as the West begins to pull out funding, start artillery striking the state because they know that they can't afford more anti-air missiles. But the question of being able to run any positive operation is a question of having the money to do so in the first place. And that money doesn't just fall out of the air like rockets. Instead, it is apportioned by parliaments, it is apportioned by legislative bodies. I'm going to directly engage with closing government because their case is very similar to ours, except the vast majority of their mechanisms are incorrect. First, on the question of it being diplomatically harmful, incorrect. Oftentimes, the states that you choose to help and aid are states that you have long-standing allyships with, i.e. Ukraine, i.e. Taiwan. In those instances, if you don't help offensive operations, you will seem like a failed ally and will threaten or jeopardize other allyships. For example, whether or not Japan thinks you will protect them, it means things like Article 4 can be revised. So it's actually better for you diplomatically to give offensive, not defensive weapons. Second, on the question of escalation, they say that escalation is going to happen when you enter into a war. This is incorrect for 2 reasons. One, escalation likely already would have happened at the point at which you gave any aid to the state, and this is contingent on the question of deterrence, which we tell you remember happens in higher degrees at the point at which you show you're more willing to give aid in the first place. Then they say that at CG, they say that it's very hard to take offensive stances because the political arena isn't in such a way that you can get those positive stances. The issue with this is they misunderstand what these states look like when they go to war. The invasion has already happened. You need to retake cities. You need to defend cities from further incursion. This is the unique mechanism for why people think it is just and okay to give offensive weapons. It is not a question of them not needing it. It's a question of them needing to fight off invaders who are at their home front, of taking back key resource lines and supply lines, doing offensive attacks to get that capacity. This means that they both A, recognize that it's important in the political arena, and B, allow for the funding to get through in the first place. Because what they tell you at GovWhip is that the defensive funding they recognize will take forever. The issue with this claim is that if the political arena recognizes the defensive funding takes long amounts of time, that increases the risk that it doesn't get passed in the first place. That is, if people think that they're going to enter into another forever war, they will just not give out a portion at all, which cuts their case back massively. The next thing they say is that, for example, weapons are more expensive, and that's the reason why you won't do them. Flip this claim. It's just the case that warhawks still control large parts of Parliament and Congress across the Western world. They still have incentives to, for example, get back-in from Raytheon or from other PMCs that they sell weapons to. They are happy to take multi-billion-dollar defense contracts so that they can sell weapons to these states. They will absolutely lobby for offensive weapons, especially if they're more expensive. And the question of whether or not it's over doesn't matter. Because the unique nuance we give to you is that when you have offensive operations, every major victory elongates the amount of time that you are sending aid. Defensive victories don't exist. They're just, oh, we stopped another bombing run. On our side, retaking major cities or dealing major blows creates the impetus amongst the people that you are winning or moving forward, which means more money comes in because it is politically palatable, which is why you saw more and more aid go to Ukraine as they began pushing back the Russian lines. This means that you just have a way better political climate for getting more money when you are catering to offensive operations, both from the elites who are going to do things like lobby and from the people on the ground who believe that this is a war that can be won. Also, the only other thing I need to deal with at CG is the question of bills, because they say this can happen without bills. Incorrect. This is not true for airstrikes or anti-air missiles. I'll take one from opening.
Matkaf's impacts are never realized because we proved to you that wars never get that long. Even if they are right, the West is often wrong in the side they back. The increased casualties prove that we are the most certain.
You just say it doesn't get that long. That's unquantifiable and an assertion. Any major state can elongate wars into the matter of years, which is already when funding is drying up. Closing, do you have a POI?
Yeah, so much of this is just kind of speculative. Like, the issue is that you're unsuccessful with your offensive weapons because you're seen as allowing greater death and warmongering. Like, you can spin a narrative one way, it doesn't mean you're gonna work.
Yeah, the issue with this is that you need to prove that your side, the narrative also works. I already just explained that major victories allow the narrative to perpetuate. On your side, those victories don't come, and the narrative at the top line is unpersuasive. So there's never the impetus for more money, and you get less money in the beginning. With that out of the way, CG's case doesn't work because the political arguments that they go for and that their case is hinged on are actually arguments for the op, because it's harder for them to get more money, and it's harder for them to get consistent forms of money. But also, we give you other reasons for why this is the case. Things like, for example, the West hating insurgent groups and hating the Middle East. So they're very eager to do things like give weapons if the counterfactual is allowing for them to step in instead. And if it is billed to people like that, then they're even more willing to do things like give those weapons. Now, I want to weigh this very explicitly against top half, against OO, because OO, to their credit, says things like, we will be able to have the war stop sooner, or says something to the effect of the political landscape wanting it one way or the other. The issue with their case is twofold. One, it is contingent. It is contingent on the question of being able to stop a war fast enough, which they don't prove, because they would have needed to stop a war within a matter of weeks or months before the first apportionment of funds dries up and they need to go back to Congress and get more money. And if they don't prove that, they needed to have proven the political efficacy. They only proved that, for example, turnover creates risk. But as we tell you, remember that turnover is uncertain, and it is unclear if the new person will be either pro or anti-war. We give you much more comprehensively why the people who actually pass this bills, i.e. Congress, have constitutional support from the bottom and elite support from the lobbies at the top to engage in giving more money to these places, which is how Ukraine got so much money at the beginning of the war in the first place. Then, I want to handle OG. OG says that they can stop encroachment and that over time, a war of attrition just ends everything. The issue with this argument is quite simple, that in order for them to stop everything, they need to have proven that a war of attrition is one that the small state could win. We already explained to you at extension that if it is the case that a war of attrition begins to happen, the small state loses money far faster than the large state, because the perception of a never-ending war that doesn't do anything is one that voters hate, because it reminds them of the failed wars of the attack on terror, which is why when you have defensive encampments, it's not pretty to say our missiles deflected 20 Russian missiles. It is pretty to say that our missiles destroyed a major military stronghold in Russia. Very proud